Hi, boys and girls. Today we're going to start a new novel. It's one of my favorites. It's called Charlotte's Web. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Chapter 1 is called Before Breakfast. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother. Her mother said, "Out to the hog house. Some pigs were born last night." "I don't see why he needs an axe," continued Fern. She was only 8 years old. "Well," said her mother, "one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything. So your father has decided to do away with it." "Do away with it?" shrieked Fern. "You mean kill it just because it's smaller than the others?" Mrs. Arable put down the pitcher of milk. "Don't yell, Fern. Your father is right. The pig would only die anyway." Fern pushed a chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping wet by the time she caught up with her father. She was crying, "Please don't kill it. It's unfair." And Mr. Arable stopped walking. "Fern," he said gently, "you have to learn to control yourself." "Control myself!" yelled Fern. "This is a matter of life and death, and you're talking about controlling myself?" Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took a hold of the axe and tried to pull it away from her father's hands. "Fern," said her dad, "I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now you run along." "But it's unfair," cried Fern. "The pig couldn't help it that it was born small, could it?" "Dad, if I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me?" Mr. Arable smiled. "Certainly not," he said. "But this is different. A little girl is one thing. A little runty pig is another." "I see no difference," said Fern, as she was still hanging on to the axe. "This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of." A silly look came over John Arable's face. He seemed almost ready to cry himself. "All right," he said. "You go back to the house, and I will bring the runt in when I come back. I'll let you start it on a bottle, just like a baby. Then you'll see what trouble a pig can be." When Mr. Arable returned to the house about a half an hour later, he carried a carton under his arm. Fern was upstairs changing her sneakers. The kitchen table was set for breakfast, and the room smelled of coffee and bacon. "Put it on her chair," said Mrs. Arable. Mr. Arable set the carton down at Fern's place. Then he walked to the sink and washed his hands and dried them on the towel. Fern came slowly down the stairs. Her eyes were red from crying. As she approached her chair, the carton wobbled, and there was a scratching noise. Fern looked at her father. Then she lifted the lid of the carton, and there inside, looking up at her, was a newborn pig. It was a white one. It was so cute. "He's yours," said her father. "Saved from an untimely death, and may the good Lord forgive me for this foolishness." Fern couldn't take her eyes off the tiny pig. "Oh," she whispered, "look at him. He's absolutely perfect." She closed the carton carefully. First, she kissed her father, and then she kissed her mother. Then she opened the lid again and lifted the pig out and held her against her cheek. At this moment, her brother Avery came into the room. Avery was 10. He was heavily armed. He had an air rifle in one hand and a wooden dagger in the other. "What's that?" he demanded. "What's Fern got?" Their mom said, "She's got a guest for breakfast. Now wash your hands and wash your face, Avery. Let's see it, said Avery. You call that miserable thing a pig? That's a fine specimen of a pig. It's no bigger than a white rat. Wash up and eat your breakfast, Avery, said his mother. The school bus will be coming in about a half an hour. Avery said, Can I have a pig too, Pop? No, I only distribute pigs to early risers, said their father. Fern was up at daylight, trying to rid the world of injustice. As a result, now she has a pig. It's a small one to be sure, but nevertheless, it's a pig. It just shows what can happen if a person gets out of bed early. Come on, let's eat. But Fern couldn't eat until her pig had had a drink of milk. Mrs. Arable found a baby bottle and gave it to Fern. She poured warm milk into the bottle, put the nipple over the top, and handed it to Fern. And she said, Here you go. Give him his breakfast. A minute later, Fern was seated on the floor in the corner of the kitchen with her infant between her knees, teaching it how to suck from the bottle. The pig, although tiny, had a good appetite and caught on quickly. The school bus honked from the road. Run! Yelled Mrs. Arable, taking the pig from Fern and slipping a donut into her hand. Avery grabbed his gun and grabbed another donut. The children ran out to the road and climbed into the bus. Fern took no notice of the others on the bus. She just sat there and stared out the window, thinking what a blissful world it was and how lucky she was to now be in charge of a pig. By the time the bus reached school, Fern had named her pet, selecting the most beautiful name that she could think of. She whispered to herself, Its name is Wilbur. She was still thinking about the pig when the teacher said, Fern, what is the capital of Pennsylvania? And Fern said, Wilbur. And here she is. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called Wilbur. Fern loved Wilbur more than anything. She loved to pet him, to feed him, and to put him to bed. Every morning, as soon as she got up, she warmed his milk, tied his bib on, and held the bottle for him. Every afternoon, when the school bus stopped in front of her house, she jumped out and ran to the kitchen to feed him another bottle. She fed him again at supper time and again just before going to bed. Her mom gave him his feeding around noontime each day when Fern was still at school. Wilbur loved his milk, and he was never happier than when Fern was warming up a bottle for him. He would stand and gaze up at her with his adoring eyes. For the first few days of his life, Wilbur was allowed to live in a box near the stove in the kitchen. Then, when Mrs. Arable complained, he was moved to a bigger box out in the shed. At 2 weeks of age, he was moved outdoors. It was apple blossom time, and the days were getting warmer. Mr. Arable fixed a small yard especially for Wilbur under an apple tree, and gave him a large wooden box full of straw with a doorway cut into it so he could walk in and walk out whenever he pleased. Fern said, "But won't he be cold at night?" "Oh, no," said her father. "You can watch and see what he does." Carrying a bottle of milk, Fern sat down under the apple tree inside the yard. Wilbur ran to her and she held the bottle for him. When he had finished the last drop, he grunted and walked sleepily into the box. Fern looked through the door. Wilbur was poking the straw with his snout. In a short time, he had dug a hole right in the straw. He crawled into the tunnel and disappeared from sight, completely covered with straw. Fern was amazed, and it also relieved her mind to know that her baby would sleep covered up and would stay warm. Every morning after breakfast, Wilbur walked out to the road and Fern waited, and he waited with Fern until the bus had come. She would wave goodbye to him, and he would stand and watch the bus until it vanished around the corner. While Fern was in school, Wilbur was closed inside his yard. But as soon as she got home in the afternoon, she would take him out, and he would follow her all around the place. If she went upstairs, Wilbur would wait at the bottom step until she came down. If she took her doll for a walk in the doll carriage, Wilbur followed along. And Fern, sometimes on these journeys, Wilbur would get tired, and Fern would pick him up and put him in the baby carriage right alongside her baby doll. Then she would cover him up with the blanket. He looked so cute with his eyes when they were closed because his lashes were so long. The doll would close her eyes too, and Fern would wheel the carriage very slowly and smoothly as not to wake up her babies. One warm afternoon, Fern and Avery put on bathing suits and went down to the brook for a swim. Wilbur tagged along with Fern. When she went into the brook, Wilbur went in with her. He found the water quite cold. It was too cold for his liking. So while the children swam and played and splashed water at each other, Wilbur amused himself in the mud along the edge of the brook, where it was warm and delightful and sticky and oozy, just like pigs like it. Every day was a happy day, and every night was peaceful. Wilbur was what farmers called a spring pig, which simply means that he was born in the springtime. When he was 5 weeks old, Mr. Arable said he was now big enough to sell, and he would have to be sold. Fern broke down and cried, but her father was firm about it. Wilbur's appetite had increased, and he was beginning to eat scraps of food in addition to milk. Mr. Arable was not willing to provide for him any longer. He had already sold Wilbur's 10 other brothers and sisters. "He's got to go, Fern," he said. "You have had your fun raising a baby pig, but Wilbur is not a baby any longer, and he has to be sold." Her mom then suggested, "Call up the Zuckermans. Your Uncle Homer sometimes raises a pig, and if Wilbur gets there to live, you can walk down the road and visit him as often as you like." "How much money should I ask for him?" Fern asked. "Well," said her father, "he is a runt. Tell your Uncle Homer that you have a pig for sale, and you'll sell it to him for $6. And then just see what he says." It was soon arranged. Fern called her Aunt Edith, and her Aunt Edith got Uncle Homer on the phone. When he heard that the price was only $6, he said he would buy the pig. The next day, Wilbur was taken from his home under the apple tree, and he went to live on the Zuckerman's farm. And that's the end of chapter 2. Thank you.